It was after Vatican II, and Dietrich said to Bella Dodd, who was high up in the Communist Party at that time, Bella, I think something happened after Vatican II. There's something going on in the church. And Bella answered, you think? I know. I personally put over 1,000 men into seminaries to infiltrate the church.
Hey, I'm Jim Havens. Good to meet you. I host a radio show called The Simple Truth, where we pursue the good, true, and beautiful and proclaim the life-giving reality of Jesus and his Catholic Church. Stick around. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below. Understand what has gone on in the history of the church in the United States over the past many decades. And this topic today really gets into much of that history, specifically related to communism and moral relativism. We're going to get into all of this today. Our topic is The Devil and Bella Dodd. It's a new book, and it's entitled precisely that, The Devil and Bella Dodd, One Woman's Struggle Against Communism and Her Redemption. It's authored by Dr. Mary Nicholas and Dr. Paul Kengor. It's published by tanbooks.com is where you can find it. It's fresh, brand new here from Tanbooks, tanbooks.com. But we are blessed to have Dr. Mary Nicholas with us. She is a retired physician and research librarian. She was active in the University Faculty for Life. She has contributed articles to both the American Thinker and Canada Free Press, and now author of The Devil and Bella Dodd. Dr. Mary Nicholas, thank you for being with us today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a great blessing to have you with us. So if we can begin with the personal story, just share a little on your background. What drew your interest to Bella Dodd?
Well, my mother was very active in fighting against communism. This was in the 50s, the era of McCarthy. And she had a relative who was sort of working with her. They were both interested in getting to the bottom of what this communist conspiracy was. So I was all ears. Aunt Eliza would come out and talk to my mother. She would go to the communist meetings in New York City. And then she'd come back and report to my mother. And of course, I was all ears. And I remember one day she came back and she said, my mother was a recent convert to Catholicism. And she said, Barbara, they have infiltrated every single church, and don't think they won't infiltrate yours. And that was never erased from my memory. And so I had this in the back of my mind as I saw politics developing in this country and in the church. And finally, about, I would say, maybe 20 years ago, I was living in Connecticut, and I think God was waking me up, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing and hearing in terms of the sermons that the priests were giving. And so I decided to make an experiment, and every Sunday I would go to a different church. I had earplugs, and I would give the priest maybe 3 minutes to speak, and I would just put the earplugs in because I figured I do not want to be exposed to heresy. And it was pathetic because I knew better. I had a very good background in catechetics. But for the ordinary Catholic listening to this, they wouldn't have known what was true and what was not true. It was really, it was like a sword through my heart because I just couldn't believe it. So I decided to go back, retrace my steps, as it were, and investigate communism and its what it had done to the church. And during this time, luckily, I shouldn't say luckily, but providentially, I met Alice von Hildebrand. And she was a saintly woman who had a wonderful background in philosophy and theology, as did her husband, Dietrich von Hildebrand. They knew what was going on. They were good friends with Bella Dodd. And I found out that she didn't live too far from me. So I was making all sorts of contacts, calls, letters, everything, trying to get in touch with someone who knew what was going on in the church. And I finally wrote to Alice and I said, "Can you help me out?" And she said, "Oh, please come up and see me." So I told her I wanted to write a book about Bella, and she was actually at that point one of the few people who had a personal relationship with Bella. And she said, "Do come up, do come up." So she and I had maybe 3 or 4 interviews, and she remembered everything as clear as a bell, everything that Bella had told her. So I remember this one story in particular. It was after Vatican II. And Dietrich said to Bella Dodd, who was high up in the Communist Party at that time, he said to her, "Bella, I think something happened after Vatican II. There's something going on in the church." And Bella answered, "You think? I know. I personally put over 1,000 men into seminaries to infiltrate the church." And each time she would tell me the story, it would not move 1 inch one way or the other. She repeated it verbatim. And it was a clear confirmation for me that something drastic had happened and needed to be addressed. You cannot solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And so it was very clear that Bella knew, that Alice knew, and that this had to get out. So that was sort of how I began in earnest doing more research on the Communist Party and its relationship with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, very interesting history to recount there. And so it really does beg the question. I mean, to my understanding, Dr. Nicholas, you have done more research on this question, on Bella Dodd and on the possible communist infiltration of the Catholic Church than anybody else. At the end of that research, when you look at all the evidence, what is your conclusion? Is that testimony from Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, is that something that you would say the evidence, it's not just one piece of testimony from Dr. von Hildebrand, but that there are other corroborating pieces of evidence that do point to the fact or perhaps the likelihood that that this actually was the case, that more than 1,000 communists were infiltrated into the Catholic priesthood?
Well, I think the answer is from a statement by Bishop Schneider just recently. And he said the church is in ruins. He's not someone to exaggerate or, elaborate. He just made that statement. And I think even though there are pockets of wonderful Catholics and some outstanding, really heroic priests, I think there's no getting away from the reality that the church is in desperate straits. And one of the reasons it's in this shape is from the communist infiltration. It's not the only one. We don't mention, for instance, the infiltration of the Masons, but there's certainly communism where they had to have gone right into seminaries and poisoned them with this rot. Is one of the clear answers.
There's just a lot in this book that is so good, The Devil and Bella Dodd. You can get it at tanbooks.com. And it reads as follows with respect to this one aspect of Bella Dodd and Bishop Sheen, now Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen. It says this, that Bella Dodd's reported comments about her role in helping to infiltrate the Catholic Church in America with over 1,000 communist men can be found all over the internet. And again, much, if not most, of the writing is scant in reliable documentation. It is frankly a mess. Here in this book, we have taken particular care to report what Bella both did say and did not say. Our primary interest in pursuing her FBI file was precisely in search of documentation for information regarding that alleged infiltration. We have been sorry to see, at least so far, that confirming information in her FBI file still has not been released. That is not a surprise. Of all the infiltration and deception that Bella Dodd dealt with in her infiltration with the devil of communism, this was the most pernicious. It remains the most sensitive. As we shall share, her confessor, Fulton Sheen, advised her to be extremely careful, if not to the point of silence, regarding the details of this infiltration. We were told that Sheen told Bella Dodd not to share names of any corrupted clergy. So, Dr. Nicholas, I'd like to ask you about this. This puzzles me. I first heard about this when I watched your interview with Dr. Jennifer Robach Morse of the Ruth Institute, a great interview. And in that, this comes up. And I was a bit surprised by it. I would be surprised why Monsignor Fulton Sheen, then Monsignor Fulton Sheen, would want this to be so secretive. If there were 1,000 men, communist men, who had infiltrated the Catholic Church and were in the priesthood, rising up the ranks, I would think that it would be very important to blow the whistle on that and to expose that, and because souls are at stake and they're leading people astray. But I don't know, what's your take as you take it all in?
It's a very difficult question. We should add that in 1952, Bishop Sheen was in Paris, and he gave a speech there about this precise thing. And it was reported in the New York Times front page, April 28th, 1952. And the headline was, "Sheen in Rome says Red agents tried to infiltrate the priesthood." I don't think he would say that unless he had a very, very good reason. And then the article goes on to say that the American communists were under secret orders in 1936 to infiltrate the Roman Catholic priesthood. The 57-year-old auxiliary bishop of New York spoke to what was described as an overflowing congregation in the American Catholic Church of Santa Susana. This was the beginning of the planting of forces of evil communism within the religious communities to destroy them from within. He said, a call for volunteers to enter religious orders and make the great sacrifices of the life of a seminarian was made at a secret Red meeting in a large American city. I mean, that pretty much tells you what he believed and what was going on. Why he didn't want it to be exposed, I think, is difficult to answer. I think, for one thing, the idea of whistleblowers and that whole culture was not the same back then. And second of all, he would not be able to reveal anything that Bella had told him in confession, right? So what else are we left with but that he made a prudential decision that this should not come out? Not that it shouldn't come out. He did it in Rome, but that names were not to be named.
In this book, you have an entire chapter that is devoted to this topic: Bella and communists target and infiltrate the Catholic Church. We do have a lot of testimony, a lot of bits of evidence that all kind of fit together in this chapter. It's a very illuminating chapter. Here's one little bit to kind of help people to understand how communist infiltration worked in general. And again, this is certainly documented to have gone on within teachers' unions, workers' unions, even in political parties and in Congress. I mean, this was going on. The communists, they were infiltrating institutions, starting front groups, doing all sorts of activity. All of that comes out very strongly in School of Darkness. I'm sure it does as well in The Devil and Bella Dodd. It's important to understand all of this. So if it's just a sort of logical conclusion, if they were infiltrating all these other areas, certainly they would have some effort to try to infiltrate the Catholic Church. And we do have strong evidence that The Devil and Bella Dodd, this book, lays out regarding the infiltration of the Protestant communities. And here's one that goes along with that. Manning Johnson here explaining to Congress in July 1953 with this testimony, quote, "It is an axiom in communist organization strategy that if an infiltrated body has 1% Communist Party members and 9% Communist Party sympathizers with well-rehearsed plans of action, they can effectively control the remaining 90%. And particularly jarring, it goes on in the book to say, Johnson spoke to the infiltration of churches and seminaries in particular, quote, "In the large sections of the religious field, due to the ideological poison which has been filtered in by communists and pro-communists through seminaries, the backlog of sympathizers and mental prisoners of socialistic ideology is greater than the 10% necessary for effective control," end of quote. All it took, the book concludes here, was merely 1% Communist Party members and 9% sympathizers. A trusting flock could, in the hands of a few deceitful shepherds, be led into spiritual harm. It was that sort of especially insidious infiltration that Bella Dodd looked to next, and goes on here with a section about seminaries as the neck of a funnel. You know, anybody who's been around faithful priests who have gone through seminaries in the past, 10, 20, 30 years, 40 years, they have stories to tell, oftentimes horrible stories about their experiences within Catholic seminaries, and they just had to try to keep their head down and get through, many good men being weeded out if they seem to be too faithful. So what is your comment here, Dr. Nicholas, on how the communists may have affected the seminaries in general, and if all this anecdotal evidence that people would know of based on folks that they've talked to that have been in these seminaries that would seem to line up, any hard piece of evidence that we have about the seminaries being infiltrated in this way?
Well, there was a wonderful researcher in Congress, J.B. Matthews, who's written a lot, and he wrote in the 40s and 50s. He wrote about the communists in the Protestant seminaries quite a bit, and they even had someone they called the Red Dean. They spread them out throughout all the Protestant seminaries, and then what I'm thinking is, what do you do with ecumenism? If all these Protestants have wittingly or unwittingly become communists, then all we have to do mix a little ecumenism with that, and it gets out to the Catholics. So they've got a couple of different ways of operating. In terms of the hard evidence, I think we have that comment from Venerable Sheen in Rome when he talked about it, and the hard evidence from Alice von Hildebrand. And there were several people who were at a talk by Bella Dodd in California. She spoke to, I believe, 800 people. And we have the testimony from someone who was there. And since the book was started, we found another witness who testifies to the fact that Bella Dodd said this, that she had put over 1,000 people into Catholic seminaries. So I think you have enough with what we know, with how their tactics are in general, that it's a reasonable conclusion. I think one reason, and I just heard this weekend from a friend, people don't want to believe that this happened. People don't want to believe there's evil. And so this person said to me, "Oh, I'm so glad this happened, but my husband doesn't want to hear anything about this." Well, we have to take the blinders off. We can't just walk around in circles, because unless you face the enemy straight on, we're not going to do anything about this problem.
I want to get into one more piece of evidence before we really drill down to how to navigate where we are today based on looking at this information and what it means to us. And so let's look at this piece of evidence. I think this is very important, and this is called the policy of the outstretched hand. And this is something we know is absolutely true. This was a term used to appeal to Roman Catholics that the communists did. This was a plan the communists put into play, the policy of the outstretched hand. It was, you refer to it in the book as it was an olive branch in one hand and a dagger in the other. Dr. Nicholas, what can you share with us about this policy, this communist policy of the outstretched hand?
Well, I think at a certain point, the Communist Party realized they were not making the gains among Catholics and others that they had hoped through starvation and everything else. And so they said, all right, we're going to mend our ways. We're going to have this policy of the outstretched hand. We're going to reach out to you. We'll admit that we made mistakes in the past. And going forward, this is how we'll operate. The Pope in Rome knew they were much more clever than later days, I think. They knew this was a hoax, and they warned the people not to buy into it and whatever. But this policy went throughout the world, including Australia. I think it gets back to, again, people don't want to believe in evil. People don't want to believe that somebody would be this evil and deliberately try to destroy the Catholic Church. So you can close your eyes and ears, and that takes care of that problem. But if you look at all the evidence, including what is the latest thing that happened, was it this week? The priest, in quotes, dancing, sacrilegiously to the host. Who knows if it was a valid consecration? But that didn't come from nowhere. That's been going on for a while. And in addition to that, getting back to our particular problem, the Jesuit magazine, America, had an article just 2 years ago, I believe, saying it was entitled The Catholic Case for Communism. I mean, anybody who knows anything knows that's absolutely absurd. But not only did he get away with it, but the editor of the magazine backed him up and said, yes, that's a good policy. So no human being can solve the problems we have in the Catholic Church, no matter what they do. This has got to be solved by our Lord himself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are. If this book could do one thing, and that is open people's eyes to the possibility of this evil, it will have done a lot.
For folks that are confused perhaps about the church's teaching on communism, you put these quotes in the book from Pope Pius XI. This is quite clear. This is what he said at the time in the 30s and in the 40s. He said, quote, "It is unfortunately true that even today there exists a common enemy threatening everything all over the world, even the sanctuary of the family, the state, and society. That enemy is communism, which is trying to penetrate everywhere and, alas, has already penetrated so many places by violence, by plot, and by deceit, by going so far as to clothe its appearances with the best intentions." He also commented on how communism was more menacing when, quote, "as has been the case most recently, it adopts less violent attitudes and less profane appearances," end of quote. And that is the truth, right? That was one of the tactics of the communists, is that they knew how to sell it. They knew how to package things in a way to deceive people. And not only that, but They're very quick and clever with regard to names and labels in order to deceive people. And so one of those tricks is that, look, you never know what name this evil is going to pop up under. Sometimes it can be quite clear and called communism, other times progressivism, sometimes socialism, democratic socialism, the class struggle, we're just for the little guy, all kinds of areas that this evil pops up under. And to me, when you rip it all back to say, what are we really looking at here? To me, we're looking at two things very, very clearly, two evils that we have to understand and look them square in the eye and see where they are trying to deceive us and our families, and we have to come firmly against them and advance the opposite truth in these areas. And one of these areas is moral relativism. So this belief that there's no such thing as moral absolutes. We can just craft our own morality to be whatever we want it to be. We can decide whatever we want is good and evil. And if we believe that kind of a lie, right, if that lie is being inserted or different moral absolutes are being downplayed or de-emphasized or not spoken of, what goes along with this is that there can also be no God, right? There can be no divinely revealed truth, certainly, if you don't believe in absolute truth, and not even any natural moral truths. So no natural sense of right and wrong written on our hearts. It's cutting against all of that. So what we're really talking about here is a view of the human person, a view of the world as this atheistic humanism, which really is more than just atheistic, to take God out of the center of man and say God is not the center, man is the center. It's actually satanic. This is what we see at the very beginning of creation with the angels, non serviam, I will not serve, the battle cry of Lucifer himself. And so Bella Dodd said in one of her interviews, quote, this whole question of morality, the question of humanism as far as man is concerned and what he is, man is God, she said. That's the whole approach of the Soviet system, and it's the approach that we're beginning to adopt. The God is dead movement is by no means a college prank. It's a well-considered cutting of the underpinnings of our civilization, end of quote. We see this run amok at scale in our time. Marxism is another way to say it. We have seen this. We've seen the fruits of this, the bad, evil fruits of this, and we're living through it. If we can't see through this now, how are we ever going to see through it when they're trying to tell us that a man is not a man, a woman is not a woman, we're all the same, redefining marriage, redefining the child in the womb, do whatever you want, let's murder innocent human beings by the thousands every day. All of this is evil, and we've got to see through it, and we've got to get back to absolute moral truth. We've got to get back to putting God at the center, Jesus at the center. And so this really, to me, is what it all comes down to. As you see it, Dr. Nicholas, as you survey it all, what do you look at the core of all of this?
I agree. I think it's a total defamation of God. Atheism is not leave God alone, don't do anything. Atheism hates God. They hate God. And we're seeing this in our civilization now. And I believe I hate to be a pessimist, but I believe it's going to get worse. If you can kill 7 million Ukrainians by starvation, including children, and have it reported, I think, in only 2 or 3 newspapers in the United States, and not a word said about it, I think you can do an awful lot.
Tell us more, I guess, about that since you raise it. And I gotta be honest, I'm not in the know on this. Tell us more about what you know about the starvation in Ukraine.
The Ukrainian starvation took place not long after Stalin was in office in quotes, and he was trying to consolidate his power, and he said at one point, we may lose the Ukraine. Now remember that the Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. It wasn't just any little country. It was the breadbasket for the whole of Europe. And So he decided that he would let them starve. The best explanation for it is, I think somebody's going to put it in the show notes, the movie, The Soviet Story. And I don't know how this man compiled all this information, but it shows the Russian troops galloping into these Ukrainian towns and just leveling them. And the people actually on the streets literally starving in front of your eyes. And if someone would go out like to the field just to grab a couple of seeds to eat, anything, they would just shoot them.
Yeah.
So in 1932, approximately 7 million Ukrainians died from this starvation. It was totally deliberate.
Dr. Nicholas, let me ask you this. This is something that I ponder as I think about this communist infiltration of our institutions, but particularly of our Catholic Church. I mean, you outline here in chapter 13 of the book not only infiltration of the Catholic seminaries, but infiltration of Catholic lay organizations, establishment of front groups, Catholic Committee for Human Rights, infiltration of churches, seminaries, youth groups, and more. And there's a lot here with respect to this, to what the communists were able to accomplish in these infiltrations. And so look, if this took place in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and this was going on, and let's say that this claim is true, that Bella Dodd actually personally saw to it that over 1,000 men, 1,100 men, whatever it would be, entered the seminaries as an infiltration, a communist infiltration of the Catholic seminaries, and then they made their way up the hierarchy the best that they could. What would be the ramifications now? So if they did this, then they would be using all sorts of deception to influence people, which would be very effective. And then at a certain point, though, you would get generationally down the road where I would think, so we wouldn't have people that would be necessarily communist infiltrators anymore, but you would have people that had such poor formation, or such a formation really in lies and errors that were specifically put in there to try to destroy faith and morals of people individually, and then of the teaching, so that the true teaching wouldn't be proclaimed, which is where we would find ourselves today. And it seems to be where we do find ourselves today. I just was talking to a woman just yesterday who told me she heard one time in her entire life that that her priest preached anything about abortion, that she ever heard a priest talk about abortion from the pulpit. And so you hear these stories. We all have different experiences that would line up with this. What is your take? How should we look at it now based on the sort of trickle-down influence of this infiltration?
I think that each individual person is responsible for educating him or herself. And I think you have to go back to old documents of the church, to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and pray to the Holy Spirit to enlighten you, because you're not, as I said, when I was in Connecticut, and there were a few exceptions that were wonderful, but you're not going to get this from the ordinary parish today, unfortunately, because they have not been formed, or they've been formed incorrectly. Part of the tactics of propaganda is telling lies and trying to trip you up. But part of it is withholding the truth. So all they had to do was withhold the truth for, let's say, 75 years, and here we are. And also, I'll point out that some of these men who infiltrated the church, where would they be at the time of Vatican II? I'll tell you where they were. I think some of them were there. And we know for a fact some communists were there because the Russian Orthodox Church was there. So that taints Vatican II with communism, no matter what you want to call it, but that's what happened.
Was that a helpful video for you? I sure hope so. That's why we do this show, to help real people get real results, advancing in the way, the truth, and the life that we're made for. It's called The Simple Truth. It's a radio program Monday through Friday, and we live stream it right here on this channel. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share if you would be so kind. And if you like that last video, here's another one I think you might get a lot out of.